Hello my dear friends, in this story I will tell you how one winter night in Blackstone tore my soul to pieces, leaving me between passion and the abyss. This isn't just a story, it's a confessional about how I lost everything I loved in pursuit of something I couldn't let go of. Get comfortable, because this truth will burn until the very end. My name is David, I'm 20 now, but back then in December I was 19, and I had no idea that a trip to my father's old house would turn into such a storm of emotions. It all started when my father decided to invite his younger brother, Uncle Caleb, to spend Christmas vacation with us at the country cottage. I supported the idea immediately because Caleb was always the kind of person I could talk to about anything, unlike my stern and short-tempered father. He arrived in the late afternoon, when the snow had covered everything and the frost was penetrating my bones even through the thick parka. My dad and I were waiting for him on the porch, and I noticed right away how Caleb had transformed since the last time I'd seen him a couple years ago. He looked strong, trim, with broad shoulders and a confident posture, like he'd just gotten out of the gym where he trained clients. He worked as a fitness trainer in Boston. After dinner, he offered to heat up the sauna, a small wooden cabin behind the house that my father had built when I was still in high school. Caleb was into healthy living, running marathons, drinking smoothies, and the sauna was a way for him to de-stress after a long drive. I agreed to join him, figuring it was the perfect excuse to warm up on such an icy evening while my dad stayed in the living room watching the news. It was already warm inside when we entered the sauna, steam rising from the hot stones and the air smelling like heated cedar. I settled on the bench, wrapping the towel around my waist, and watched Caleb toss water onto the stones, making the steam thicker. He pulled off his sweatshirt before he went in, and I couldn't help but notice his figure, muscular, sculpted, like a man who knew how to get his body in perfect shape. We talked about his work, about how I was doing in college, but I suddenly noticed my gaze lingering on his body. It was unexpected, because I'd always been able to keep my thoughts in check, especially around my family. Then he sat closer, and I felt the heat from his skin mingle with the heat of the sauna, and my heart beat a little harder than usual. I tried to distract myself by looking at the patterns on the wooden walls or listening to the steam hissing, but my eyes kept coming back to him, his broad back, the drops of sweat glistening on his skin. At one point he looked up at me, smiled, and said something about the sauna relieving fatigue, and I just nodded, feeling a strange feeling growing inside. That night, lying in my room, I couldn't get rid of the image of him that was stuck in my head. It was the first time I'd ever thought that maybe I was seeing Caleb not just as an uncle, but as someone who evoked emotions in me that I wasn't expecting. I woke up the next morning thinking it was just the effect of a change of scenery or lack of sleep, but in the back of my mind I knew it was just beginning. I went downstairs for coffee while the house was still asleep and tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just thinking too much. But when I heard Caleb's footsteps on the stairs and saw him coming down in a simple t-shirt and jeans, my heart started to twitch again, and I realized that this vacation wasn't going to be at all what I had hoped for. It was the moment I realized that something inside me had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I could get it all back. I spent the night restless, because the memories of Caleb in the sauna kept me awake, and I tossed and turned in bed, trying to make sense of my thoughts. I went downstairs to make myself some coffee while the house was quiet and my dad and Caleb didn't seem to be awake from last night. As I walked down the hallway past Caleb's room, I noticed that his door was slightly ajar, and there were muffled noises coming from it, which I took to be the mumbling of the radio at first. But something made me slow down, and I felt my pulse quicken, as if instinct told me I was about to encounter something unexpected. I don't know what moved me, but instead of just walking on, I quietly moved closer and carefully opened the door a little more, trying not to give away my presence. Inside, I saw Caleb. He was standing with no clothes on, with a towel carelessly rolled up on the edge of the bed, watching something on a laptop that was open on the nightstand by the window. The sounds were indecipherable at first, but then I realized it wasn't just a movie, it was an adult movie with men, and the realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. He stood there, tense, his muscles twitching slightly to the rhythm of what was happening on the screen, completely absorbed in what he was watching. His body looked perfect: a broad chest, well-defined abdominal muscles, strong arms, and I couldn't take my eyes off him, feeling a mixture of shock and strange attraction building inside me. I knew I shouldn't be here, that this was a violation of his personal space, but my feet felt like they were stuck to the floor, and curiosity held me in place. The faint scent of his aftershave mixed with the warmth of the room was in the air, and it only added to my confusion. At one point, he turned slightly, and the light from the screen illuminated his skin, highlighting every contour, and my breath hitched and my cheeks began to blaze with shame and excitement. I knew I had to get away, that if he saw me it would be a disaster, but I froze until he started to turn in my direction completely. I backed away quickly then, trying to move silently, and almost jogged back to my room where I flopped down on my bed, trying to regain my breath and realize what I had seen. My uncle Caleb, a man I'd known since I was a kid, was watching gay porn and clearly enjoying it, and that thought turned my whole perception of him upside down. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what that meant to me, because now my attraction to him was more than just a passing feeling. Later, I heard him leave the room and walk down the hall, and I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't see me at the door. The day passed in a strange sort of daze, and I tried to act as if nothing had happened, but every time Caleb was around, I found myself furtively studying him. That discovery was a turning point. I couldn't ignore my emotions anymore, and it scared me to my core. By late afternoon, I realized that this Blackstone vacation was turning into something far more confusing than I'd ever imagined. After that morning when I'd caught Caleb in his room, the next few days at Blackstone passed like some weird dream where I tried to act normal, but everything was boiling inside. I couldn't get the things I'd seen out of my head: his body, tense and strong, the sounds from the laptop, and the way it all stirred up feelings in me that I didn't want to admit. Caleb, on the other hand, was acting as if nothing had happened, joking with his father over dinner, telling stories about his clients in Boston, and I started to think that maybe he really hadn't noticed me at the door. But that calm only made me more nervous, because I didn't know how to look him in the eye now without giving away what was going on inside me. By the middle of the week, I realized I couldn't just keep quiet and wait any longer. I had to do something to make sense of this chaos. I decided to take a shower one morning, after my father had gone into town to get groceries, hoping the hot water would wash away some of the tension that had built up over the days. I walked past Caleb's room, trying not to look in that direction, and closed the bathroom door behind me, small and cozy with frosted windows. Turning on the water, I stood under the spray, feeling the steam envelope my body, and tried to focus on the sound of the water to shut out thoughts of him. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the scene came back to me: his figure, the light from the screen, and I realized that it wasn't just curiosity anymore, but something much deeper. Suddenly I heard the bathroom door creak softly, and my heart sank, because I remembered exactly how I'd locked it. I opened my eyes and saw a silhouette through the fogged glass of the shower. It was Caleb standing in the doorway, and his gaze, though blurred by the steam, felt like something tangible. He stepped forward and opened the shower door, and the cold air rushed in, making me wince, but I didn't move, frozen with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He stepped into the cabin, and suddenly it felt crowded. His presence filled the space, and his body heat mixed with the steam, sending shivers down my spine. "You've thought about it, haven't you?" he said quietly but firmly, and his voice sounded so close I could feel his breath on my neck. I wanted to say something back, but my throat was dry, and I just nodded, feeling the heat flood my face, not from the water, but from shame and excitement. He put his hand on my shoulder, and that light contact felt like it set me on fire from the inside, because I realized he knew I'd been peeking, knew how I felt. "I've been thinking about that too," he added, and his hand slid slowly down my back, leaving a trail of shivers I couldn't hide. We stood like that, under the running water, and I could feel his chest against my back, hard and warm, and the tension between us was almost unbearable. He took his time, just holding me, and I realized that this wasn't just an accident. It was something we both wanted, though we couldn't say it out loud. Then he turned me toward him, and I looked into his eyes so close for the first time, seeing in them not only confidence but something soft that I hadn't noticed before. We didn't say anything else. We were just there, together, and it was the moment when everything I'd been trying to suppress came out. When it was over, I lay next to him on the bed in my room, listening to him breathe and feeling the warmth of his skin under my fingers. He said it should stay between us, and I agreed, But guilt was already starting to grow inside of me because I knew I had crossed a line that couldn't be taken back. The day ended quietly, but I realized that this vacation had changed me, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to look at Caleb just as an uncle. After that morning in the shower, my days in Blackstone were a strange mixture of routine and an underlying tension that I carried inside like a heavy secret. I tried to act like I used to helping my dad shovel snow from the driveway, watching old movies with him, but every time Caleb was around, my heart clenched at the memory of what had happened between us. He remained as calm and friendly, joking about his training in Boston, telling his dad about his new marathon, and I began to wonder if what had happened was as important to him as it was to me. I lay awake at night, replaying every detail in my head: the warmth of his hands, the sound of his voice, and the way he looked at me in that moment, and it tore me between desire and guilt. I knew I'd crossed a line I shouldn't have, but part of me didn't want to change. Caleb made no indication of repeating himself, and it drove me crazy because I caught myself waiting for some sign, some move from him. I began to notice my behavior changing. I sought his company more often, sat closer to the table, lingered in the room when he was there. One night, after my father had fallen asleep in the chair by the TV, I sat with Caleb on the couch, our knees almost touching, and I could feel the warmth of his body shivering through me. I wanted to say something to let him know that I couldn't forget that day, but he just smiled his usual easy smile and turned the conversation to some nonsense about the weather. Before I left, I decided to take a chance and see if he felt the same way I did, or if it was all just a moment of weakness for him. The day before the end of vacation, the two of us were in the kitchen putting away the dishes after dinner, and I purposely stood closer than I should have while I handed him the plates. My hand accidentally touched his, and I noticed him freeze for a second, and then he looked up at me, not with his usual smile, but with something deep in his eyes that gave me hope. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, and I nodded, but everything inside was screaming that I wanted him to take matters into his own hands again, like he had that day. But he turned away, continuing to wash the dishes, and I realized that if anything was going to happen, I was going to have to make the first move. Vacation was over, and I went back to my apartment in the city, hugging my dad goodbye and shaking Caleb's hand as if nothing had changed between us. But that same night, sitting alone in my room, I got a text from him, a simple, "How are you?" But it made my insides flip, because I realized he hadn't forgotten either. Our texting started innocently, but got bolder over time. He sent a photo from practice, I responded with a snapshot in my room, and we both knew it was more than just friendly chit-chat. We agreed to erase the messages immediately afterwards so as not to leave a trace, and the secrecy only fueled my excitement. As the weeks passed, I went back to school, went out with friends, even went on dates, but Caleb remained in my thoughts like a shadow I couldn't shake off. Sometimes we wouldn't text each other for days at a time, and I'd start to think it was all in the past, but then a new text would come in and it would start all over again. I don't know if we'll see each other again, and if we do, what will happen? Part of me wants to leave it as a memory, and the other part is drawn to it more than I'm willing to admit. That vacation left a mark on me that I can't erase, and I'm still not sure if I'm proud or ashamed of it. It's been a few months since I returned from Blackstone to my city life, and I've been trying to convince myself that everything that happened with Caleb is in the past. College classes, parties with friends, random dates, I've fallen into a routine, hoping it would help me forget those vacations and how his presence had turned my world upside down. But every time my phone vibrated and I saw his name, my heart sank and I realized that no distraction could erase what we had between us. Our texts became less frequent, but they still came short, but with undertones I couldn't ignore, like pictures from his run or my morning coffee. I felt like we were both keeping our distance but not letting go of each other completely, and it kept me in a constant state of tension. Everything changed in April, when my dad unexpectedly asked me to come up for the weekend because Caleb had decided to stop by Blackstone for a couple days on his way back from Boston. I agreed, even though I was struggling with excitement and fear inside, because I didn't know how I was going to act around him after everything we'd been through. When I arrived, the snow had already melted and the house looked completely different in the spring sunshine, but the tension returned the moment I saw Caleb getting out of the car with a bag over his shoulder. He greeted me as casually as he always did, clapping me on the shoulder, but I noticed his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual, and it stirred a familiar feeling in me. The three of us sat in the living room that evening, and I tried to concentrate on my father's conversation about the roof repair, but my mind was on Caleb, who sat across from me, sipping a beer. After dinner, Dad went to bed and Caleb and I stayed to clear the table, and I felt the air between us thick again, like it had been back in December. I purposely stayed close while he put the plates in the sink, and when my hand touched his elbow, he didn't pull away, but turned to me with a slight smile that made my heart beat faster. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" He asked softly, and I nodded, unable to lie because his closeness was drawing me in like a magnet again. We went out to the backyard, where the sauna was, and sat on a bench under the starry sky, breathing in the cool spring air that smelled of melted earth and pine trees. He spoke first, telling me that he couldn't forget that day either, but he didn't want to make things harder for me because he realized how wrong it all was from a family perspective. I listened to him talk about his work, about how he was trying to distract himself, and I suddenly realized that he wasn't as confident as he seemed. There was a shadow of doubt in his voice that I hadn't noticed before. We sat close, and I felt the warmth of his shoulder next to mine, and then he put his hand on my knee, and that simple gesture brought back everything: the desire, the guilt, the confusion. We didn't cross the line again, but that night was the moment I realized it wasn't just passion, but something more I couldn't name. When I left, he hugged me goodbye, and I felt his fingers squeeze my shoulder a little harder than necessary, like he didn't want to let go either. Now, sitting in my room in the city, I think about how this connection with Caleb is a part of me that I can't cut out, even if it remains a secret. I don't know what happens next, but I'm no longer running from it. I'm accepting it as part of my story. After that spring meeting in Blackstone, I returned to my life in the city with the feeling that something inside me was finally starting to calm down, though thoughts of Caleb still popped up at the most unexpected moments. Summer came quickly, and I immersed myself in my part-time job at the coffee shop, college exams, and long walks with friends, trying not to give myself too much time to think about what had happened between us. But his messages kept coming, infrequently, once every couple weeks, but always with some warm undertone, like a photo of a sunset from his run or a joke about my love of coffee. I responded in the same vein, and this correspondence became a kind of silent support that I didn't want to lose, even if we both avoided talking about the important things. I began to notice that I no longer felt the acute guilt that had plagued me during the winter. It had given way to acceptance, albeit with a touch of anxiety. That all changed in August when Caleb texted me that he would be passing through my town on business. He had a seminar for coaches and suggested we meet for coffee afterwards. I agreed, although a wave of emotions immediately rose up inside me, from joy to fear, because I didn't know what it would be like to see him not in Blackstone, but here in my everyday life. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near my house, and I got there a little early, nervously rubbing my paper cup as I waited for him at the window. When he walked in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, with the same confident gait, I felt as if time had slowed down, and all the months of separation had dissolved into his smile. We sat at a table by the window, talking about all sorts of things: his work, how I was doing in school, how hot it was in the city this summer. But beneath the lightness, I could feel the familiar tension that was building by the minute, especially when he looked at me a little longer than necessary, or when his hand accidentally touched mine while he was taking sugar. After coffee, he suggested we take a walk in the park nearby, and I agreed because I didn't want this evening to end so quickly, even though I realized we were teetering on the edge again. We walked through the shady alleys, where the streetlights cast a soft light, and the air smelled of grass and warm asphalt after the heat of the day. At one point we stopped at a bench, and he turned to me, looking so serious that I froze, waiting for him to say something important. "I missed you, you know," he said quietly, and those words hung between us while I tried to find something to say back, because I missed you too, but I was afraid to admit it out loud. He stepped closer, and I felt the warmth of his body, familiar and exciting, and then his hand lay on the back of my neck, softly but surely, just as it had then in the shower. We stood like that, in the silence of the park, and I realized I didn't want to resist it anymore. I leaned toward him, and our lips met, tentatively at first, and then deeper, with the same passion I'd had in the winter. It wasn't like Blackstone. There was no rush or fear of being caught, just the two of us, and I could feel the tension that had been building up for months finally letting go. We didn't talk about what it meant, But when he left for his hotel and I came home, I realized I didn't want to hide from those feelings anymore. I know now that Caleb isn't just a part of my past, but someone I'm connected to, and I'm ready to see where it takes us. Lying in bed that night, I smiled thinking about him for the first time in a long time and realized that this wasn't the end, but a new beginning. After that meeting in the park that summer, I felt like I'd finally found my balance, and my connection with Caleb was something I didn't want to hide from myself anymore. The fall flew by quickly. I got caught up in my studies, worked at the coffee shop, and our texts with Caleb became a habit that kept me warm on cold evenings. We hadn't seen each other since August, but the correspondence stayed lively. He sent pictures from the gym, I shared shots of fall leaves in the park, and each time I felt like we were growing closer despite the distance between Boston and my city. I began to think that maybe we could have something real, that we could find a way to be together without destroying everything around us. But fate, as it turned out, had other plans, and everything I'd been building in my head came crashing down one November day. My father called me in the middle of the week and said he was coming into town for the weekend to visit me and discuss something important, and I agreed, not realizing that it would be more than just a family visit. When he arrived, I noticed that he looked tense. His usual sternness had been replaced by something heavier, and he immediately asked me to sit down because the conversation was going to be serious. We settled into my small living room and he pulled his cell phone out of his pocket, placing it on the table in front of me with a look like it was a bomb ready to explode. "I found this in some old stuff in Blackstone," he said quietly, and I felt a chill run down my spine because I didn't know what he meant yet. He turned on the screen, and there was a picture I'd sent Caleb last winter, one of the ones we'd erased after texting, but apparently it was saved somewhere in the cloud or on an old device. It was me in my room, wearing a thin t-shirt, wearing a smile that I'd thought was innocent at the time, but now it looked like evidence in my father's hands. "Explain to me what this means," he said, and his voice shook with contained anger, and I sat there, unable to get a word out because I realized our secret was no longer a secret. He told me that he'd found correspondence on Caleb's old tablet that he'd left behind in Blackstone, and there was enough there to put it all together: the messages, the pictures, the hints that we'd thought we were so careful about. I tried to say something to justify myself, but the words stuck in my throat, and my father looked at me with a mixture of pain and frustration that made me feel worse than ever. He said he'd already talked to Caleb and he'd confessed everything, but asked him not to blame me because he was the one who started it. He was older and should have stopped. My dad left, leaving me alone, and I sat in silence, staring at the empty table where my phone lay until the screen went out, as if taking everything I was trying to keep with me. Caleb texted me a long message later, apologizing for not being able to protect our secret and telling me that we'd better stop communicating so we didn't ruin the family further. I didn't answer because I didn't know what to say, but that night I realized that this was the end not just of our relationship, but of the part of me that believed we could come out of this unscathed. I live with that now, knowing that Caleb was more to me than I was willing to admit, but the price was too high. My dad doesn't talk about it anymore, but I see a shadow in his eyes that won't go away, and I'm learning to live with it, one step at a time. It was an ending I wasn't expecting, but maybe it was inevitable. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you liked the story, please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe.